Chris Brown, this is your life. 7 minutes.
Thanks, Almud. I appreciate it. I will try and answer your question, but I need to take it back a step in order to do that. I want to take it back to a comment that Kristof made about a jigsaw analogy. Effectively, the idea that there are pieces of the puzzle that we don't have, that we don't understand, and there are parts of wash service delivery systems that we don't fully understand the behaviour of. When I prepared to respond to Almud's question, I did a lot of research. I looked at a lot of papers, and one word kept coming up over and over again. And interestingly, I've heard it, I think, about 8 times today. I've heard it in every session today, including from both plenaries this morning. And that word is complex. Okay? We've come to a point in the evolution of the wash sector where we're starting to accept the complexity of what we're dealing with. And it is very, very complex. And if we agree that wash is complex, perhaps we should agree to engage in the language of complexity. Wash service delivery systems are effectively complex adaptive systems. And what I mean by that is they're systems that have a set core group of characteristics. And this applies to complex adaptive systems across a whole range of areas of disciplines, as Kristof referred to earlier. I mean, our weather systems are complex adaptive systems. Our political networks, our economic markets, our transport networks, these are all complex adaptive systems. And they're all areas that have accepted that and used it to understand better the behavior of the systems that they are engaged in. I'm not going to go into all the characteristics because I only have a short amount of time, but 2 characteristics I specifically want to bring up. The first is that all complex adaptive systems, regardless of context, have these characteristics, and one of them is nonlinearity. Now, on the face of it, that doesn't seem that important. What it effectively means is that because of the interconnected nature of those networks, A plus B doesn't necessarily equal C. And I'll explain why I'm bringing this up in a moment. The second characteristic is emergent behavior. And emergent behavior is, if I can explain it in as simple a way as possible, if you have a system that is made up of component parts, whether they be agents or processes within that system, the behavior of those component parts produce emergent behavior on a system level that is not only more than the sum of its parts, but it's also very different. Okay? What this means is that, to go back to the jigsaw analogy, if you don't understand every part of your system, you're blind to some parts of it, or you're not aware how they work, you can't look at the system as a whole and tell what the component parts are. And equally, you can't look at the component parts and make any meaningful prediction of what the state of that system is or what the behavior of that system is going to be. Okay? And this puts us in the wash sector in a bit of a challenging situation because, to quite a large extent, the MDGs have created what I would refer to as an access paradigm within the sector. And what I mean by that is we have a very dominant focus on coverage. And the tools we use to measure systems and to predict their behavior are very linear. We use static comparative indicators. We use linear regression. And if there's one thing that we know from complex adaptive systems, of which we're coming to the point of accepting that we are working in a complex adaptive system, then perhaps we need to understand that we are effectively trying to justify and explain that system-wide behavior by looking at a single component part. And that's not going to work. So in essence, I'm saying that we need to adapt a broader systemic view of wash service delivery systems. And this may sound pretty negative or quite challenging. I'd like to take us back to 2000 and the start of the MDGs. 6 months before, Stephen Hawkins was in the White House giving a lecture, and he said that this century is going to be the century of complexity. And complexity and its associated technologies of artificial life, agent-based modeling, which is what we've been doing here and we've shown you today, self-organization and the science of networks will revolutionize the way science is done. What we've done is taken heed of that statement, and we've, as Kristof referred to, we've looked at what other sectors have done, what other disciplines have done, and said, why are we not doing the same thing? Why are we not using the appropriate technology, using the understanding, learning from other sectors to better understand the behavior in our own sector? Even this simple model that we've very briefly demonstrated to you, or explained to you in a very simple way, and it is very, very simple, has shown some very, very interesting behavior, emergent behavior, from very, very simple structures. We've shown that basic sanitation uptake models have a dynamic equilibrium. We've shown that the relative impact of slippage is far greater than the relative impact of uptake. And if we have a coverage access paradigm, a coverage-based paradigm that focuses much more on uptake than slippage, then maybe we're putting ourselves in a very difficult situation inadvertently. We're cutting off our nose to spite our face, as it were. From an M&E's perspective, we're making it very difficult to know who to target, because we're working within a dynamic equilibrium and we're not accepting that it's dynamic. And we're also we're using an approach of implementation that makes it very easy for us to inadvertently create artificial equilibria that we then quote as coverage statistics that effectively misrepresent the true level of coverage over time. Let me just finish up. So what I'm effectively saying is, we as a sector, we're starting to accept the inherent complexity of these systems. And if we start filling in some of the pieces of the jigsaw, we can better understand some of the drivers and how specific drivers affect system-wide emergent behavior. For example, with slippage and uptake. And we've just used it as one example. And we can do the same for water. It is more complex, it is more difficult, but it's not beyond our means. Our point in relation to this argument and this debate is that without doing this, without embracing this type of thinking, we think it's hard to see how we can ever achieve the increases in efficiencies that are required to achieve everyone forever. And so to finish up, the message we have is that as it stands, it looks very much like we're going to be left with a system that looks less like everyone forever and a lot more like potentially most people most of the time.
Thank you. Okay, I would love this debate to go on forever, but sadly I know we can't do that. So I'm going to ask if I could have a volunteer to ask a pointed question of the team on my left. Anybody who'd like to ask them a pointed question? You're going to have to be quick. Ooh, yes. Would you mind going to the microphone, because we're podcasting this event? And if you don't go to the microphone, you are just a mute person. Just a nice, sharp question to make them feel uncomfortable.
Then I don't have to introduce myself. Okay, good. First of all, maybe instead of this left, first of all, I'm going to direct to you first, Barbara. Nasty question. Maybe afterward, you're not going to talk to me anymore. I am so surprised that the panels are represented by people who talk about sanitation. Water seemed to be absent. Almud was mentioning something about it. But we have so many issues also on the water sector. So anyway, that directed to you. And to the team in the left, I think the issues is not so much of the access anymore, But the most important issue, which you have mentioned a bit, Almud, is the functionality. Where you talk about water, where you talk about sanitation, you're talking about slippage, you're talking about access, you're talking about loss of data. But what we're really missing is how this water system is really functioning, how the sanitation, whether it's up the ladder, down the ladder, how is it function. I think there's not enough focus on these functionality issues. And the issues that we are struggling with is this behavioral change. And where are we with it? You seem to mention a little bit about it. But I think this is the very difficult issue that we can tackle. So can you just elaborate on behavioral change? And the last question is that I am also an economist. I believe in the power of the data. But it is so hard to get this data, and we put a lot of money in this data-driven thing, but we're not really changing the behavior. I learned a lot more today sitting in a session to listen to my friend, colleague from NEWA to tell me how to deal with gender and disability exclusivity. So maybe we should really be anecdotal. Maybe we should really use some of this practical experience rather than putting a lot of money on putting in data and it's not being used. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I asked you to be difficult. So, if I could ask the team on my left to say something about water and behaviour change, and perhaps Sanjay, I don't know how you're going to divide it up, but something on the data side as well.
I wanted to take the functionality of systems part, because you asked, the first thing you were saying, you hear a lot about access, but not how systems continue to function in sustainability. And I think you're right, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that we have to absolutely move from talking about access to talking about sustainability and functionality and how functionality can be sustained over time. But I think there are ways now, and I think there are countries that are looking precisely into that. So if you look at Indonesia, where we, a few years ago, Indonesia has thousands of these little community-run water systems, all built by different projects over the years. We calculate at some point it's at least 10,000. We don't really know the numbers because so many projects have done this. And we did a study at some point to look how many of those are still functioning. And the hypothesis behind was like, they're going to be, 90% of them are going to be dead by now. Actually, turned out that wasn't the case at all. It wasn't a hip, hip, hooray and everything was fine, but many more than we thought were actually functioning. But what they were missing every time they ran into bigger problems, bigger expenses, bigger issues that need to be taken care of, that was difficult for them. So that's when we started working with local governments to figure out what is their role going forward in providing some of these technical, managerial, financial services that these systems actually need. And I think a lot of countries that we work in nowadays actually tackle that functionality by saying there has to be this mix between the government level, this is the most appropriate, and the systems that are being built, and figuring out who's going to take care of what part of the longer-term operation in order to keep going. So I think what I'm saying is, I hear you, but I think we are no longer only talking about access, and we are no longer talking only about CLTS and getting people on the first rung of the ladder on the sanitation side. And on water, we're no longer talking about systems building, what we're talking about how they're being sustained over time. Behavioral change.
Thank you.
And update it very quickly, I'm sorry.
Okay, so on behavior change, I agree. I think behavior change is very, very, a very different paradigm. And I do wonder how, I think you do need very different types of models and different types of assumptions. And that's the thing. A model is a great, these models are really good academic exercises. The problem is you've got to look at the assumptions. On behavior change, as opposed to a kind of system-type, infrastructure system. There are different complexities. They are complex, but there are different complexities. And on behavior change, one of the things, if you kind of take social norm theory, is that you can get a critical mass. That means that you don't get slippage. We have very little data. Almud mentioned, we actually have very little data on longitudinal data on slippage. One of the few studies on CLTS, Barbara was involved in Bangladesh over, 6 years or so. Actually, the results were a lot better than we thought. But a lot of this, and this relates to the data question, a lot of the kind of evidence we have are these kind of, 30% of hand pumps in Africa don't work. That's, I know who did that study, and the person who did it would admit that it's just it's not representative. It's a snapshot. It's not longitudinal. It doesn't say whether the pump was functioning for 25 years and then stopped functioning, in which case it might be a success. It doesn't say whether the pump that's not functioning has been superseded by a better scheme and so on. So there's that element of it. There's also on the behavior change, there's the element of once you've achieved the social norm, what does slippage look like? So does the Japanese government sit there worrying about people going back to foot binding? No, because they've achieved the social norm, it's changed. Does the Dutch government sit there thinking, oh, God, what do we do about people going back to open defecation? No, because the social norm has been achieved, has been established, and that kind of regression is unlikely to happen. So the models have to be able to take on those complexities, but at the same time be able to explain to kind of policymakers what the decision-making process is, what lever they can pull in order to get an outcome. And they have to understand that. It's not good enough to say, that's what the model does, and that's what you have to do, because then no policymaker will put their kind of risk, their career, whatever, their aspirations on the line in order to achieve that.
Great. Don't clap. We don't have time for clapping now. No, it was good. It was very good, and they would clap, but I'm not going to let them. One person who's willing to ask a question of the team on my right. Yes, sir. Would you mind going to the microphone? One question would be appreciated. Although I like being child's milk.
Thank you very much to Chris and Chris. Is it not true that we have universal access to air in this world? We have. Is it not true that we are born to have universal access to these basic needs? For me, I see it that the only problem that we have is that if we have universal access to air and we have no universal access to water, I see it as a function of our greedy behaviors. The 20 most richest people in the world, only 20, have the capacity to provide universal access to all of us. So I do feel that our default position is universal access. Very soon we'll pollute all our air and we'll be moving with oxygen masks. And then we'll be arguing how impossible it is to have universal access to air.
Thanks very much. Kristof.
Thank you. I finally can talk. I think it is true. I think if we would get that money from those 20th richest people, I think we would give access to everybody. But I doubt we would give it forever. Because the problem is that we have a lot of questions that we don't answer, that we can't answer, and there's a lot of experiments that we will never do in real life, but we would like to know what the answers are, just exactly because Sanjay says there are things that are too risky to try. One of the questions, for example, you play is if you want to provide sustainable water services, if we want to talk about water, is that you have to build in a certain redundancy to have a certain level within your system. And that level of redundancy, where you want to have that, you could have two options, and I challenge you to try it in reality and do experiments to have a definite answer. But you could have a couple of more pumps, so people have alternative pumps when they break down. Or you could say, we're going to provide one pump to the village, but we'll make sure that once it breaks down, it's going to be immediately repaired, so that every time people have continuous access. It's two different approaches. You can run experiments endlessly. You'll never have all the permutations to make sure in which situation, which one is the best one. And so there is places in which you can experiment in a way that you will never be able to do in reality to understand better what is happening with your systems. A lot of people within countries in Africa don't have the same advantage as us, that we can go and see different situations and learn from them. They often grow up with one kind of situation, and if in the district they manage to do that, they go with that kind of knowledge to the national level, and they'll implement exactly what they've learned from that. And that might not be suitable for every place in their country. So there is a place in which you can experiment in a way that is fail-safe, and that you can ask, for example, if I change all my hand pumps into the same pump, the same brand, will that help me financially with all the spare parts and so on? It's an experiment no country will do. They might slowly do it, but you could do it virtually, and you can try and learn from that. And that is where I think these kind of techniques could help us.
Excellent. No clapping again, because that would only be fair, right? Okay. There was only one question, so I'm sorry, Chris. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't want to cut this short because I think it's fascinating, but I do also want my glass of wine. So I'm going to ask each side to just give us a 1-minute final pitch, 2 minutes at most, just a little final pitch, the nub of your message. Kristof or Chris, whichever one of you is.
It's very simple. The thing is, we agree what we want to achieve. And I think what we can do is we can have a little more holistic and and learn from other sectors where they have speeded up the way in which they could address certain problems by using the same kind of approaches that they have used. And the only thing that we want to advocate is that you can do that. You use methods in which you can have governance, kind of different governance methods combined with different kind of financial methods, combined with different kind of approaches, and have all these permutations work and learn from them without having to experiment them, because if we have to do that in real life, it's going to take us ages, and we'll be here 5 decades later talking about the same problems. Because when we were in Ethiopia on the symposium, we took just paragraphs out of the WHO reports from the water decade and the GMP and challenged people from which decade they were. And the thing is, we can just cut and paste from reports 3-4 decades ago and put them in reports today, and they would not look out of place. So there is something that has to change if we really want to achieve and accelerate this process.
Thank you. Chris, Sanjay? Whoa, that's confusing. Oops. Sanjay. Yes, you're not Kristof. Yeah, there's 2 Chris's, they're over there. I've got that.
All right. No, thank you for that. And I mean, I think, we agree that, that the aim is universal access.
Yes.
Right? And that it is actually possible. And I think nobody disagrees that it's complex. It is difficult, and the interesting, but the bit I have a little bit of difficulty is, I think it is very important to do analytical work and to do modeling, to look at pathways. I think that is very important. My only concern is that the models shouldn't reach a level of complexity that they are actually as complex as a real-life situation. And we have that with our colleagues in health, where they do have such good data that they can go to governments and say, what you need to do is this, and this is the outcome. Go and do it. And nobody will accept that. And they have to ditch that and start going back to the kind of approach that, the more the CSOs and that kind of approach, where you actually analyze with the policymaker rather than tell them what to do. But the learning is important. I think models do help you learn, as long as you realize that decisions are inherently political. And the models are an input, but the decisions will be taken in different ways. And that's where the complexity comes in, because everybody will take a different pathway. But we will reach universal access at some point within our lifetimes.
I'm really not inclined to have a vote now after that rousing kind of togetherness. I think if we vote now, it'll only cause decisiveness. So if, with the agreement of the floor, I think we have an agreement on the power of the simple message and agreement on the power of the complexity that's ahead of us. I have to say, I always say to my students, when I graduated in 1987, I used to really worry that I'd be out of a job before I retired. God help me. What was I thinking? So thank you very much to our panelists, Kristof and Chris and Sanjay and Almud, for taking on an almost impossible task to debate an almost impossible and unanswerable question. Thank you very much for your engagement and awakeness during the day. We really appreciate it. Please grab these guys during the evening. Also, we'll make sure the posters are around somewhere tomorrow if you want to have a closer look at those pictures. And please don't forget that the buses leave at 6:30. Thank you very much.